While renovating my house, I accidentally discovered a hidden door behind a wardrobe. Inside was a briefcase with $2 million and a photograph. When I saw who the briefcase belonged to, my hands started shaking. Good day, dear listeners. It's Maria again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always ask me how I knew. The honest answer is, I didn't. Not really. When you share a life with someone for 11 years, you stop looking too carefully at the parts that don't quite add up. You learn to sand down the rough edges in your mind, to smooth over the gaps with trust. That's what marriage does to you. It makes you a willing architect of your own blind spots. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I was 43 years old when I found what I found, and I had been a widow for exactly 26 months before that afternoon changed everything. James and I had bought the house on Callaway Drive in 2009, when Glenview was still the kind of suburb where people left their garage doors open and borrowed each other's lawnmowers without asking. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, an old oak in the backyard that I'd always planned to put a swing on. We never got around to the swing. We never got around to a lot of things. James was an investment consultant, or that's what his business card said. He traveled 3, sometimes 4 days a week. I was a high school English teacher, steady and predictable, which I think was precisely what attracted him to me in the beginning, and precisely what bored him in the end. We had no children. That was a wound that never fully closed, though we'd both learned to walk around it carefully, the way you navigate furniture in the dark. He died on a Tuesday in October, 2 years before the renovation. A highway overpass, a rainy evening, a guardrail that didn't hold. They found his car at the bottom of a 15-foot drop into shallow water. The casket at the funeral was closed. I was told not to ask too many questions about the condition of the body, and I, in my grief, complied. I was too shattered to be suspicious. I was too busy learning how to exist alone. For 2 years, I taught my 10th graders Fitzgerald and O'Connor. I graded papers at the kitchen table, I cooked dinner for one, and I began the slow, painful process of accepting that the life I had built was over. Then my sister Karen called from Portland and said the kindest, most practical thing anyone had said to me in months. "Sell the house, Sarah. Start over somewhere new. The mortgage is paid off. That's a gift. Use it." She was right. I knew she was right. So in April, I hired a contractor named Pete Garvey and began the renovation that would make the house sellable. New floors in the kitchen, fresh paint throughout. The master bathroom, which had been a procession of small disasters since 2015, finally gutted and redone. And the bedroom, James's old closet. A large, deep walk-in that I had not fully entered since his death. I had been taking clothes out through the door, reaching in and grabbing what I needed without stepping inside. A small psychological trick I played on myself. Grief does strange things to the geography of your home. Pete's assistant, a young man named Cody, was the one who suggested removing the built-in shelving along the back wall. "It's not load-bearing, Ms. Mitchell. Pulling it out will make the space feel twice as big. Better for buyers." He was right, of course. I said yes. It was a Wednesday morning. I was in the kitchen when I heard Cody call out. Not panicked, just surprised. The voice of someone who has found something unexpected behind a wall. I walked down the hallway and into the bedroom and stood in the doorway of the closet. The shelving unit had been pulled 2 feet forward, revealing the wall behind it. Except it wasn't entirely a wall. There was a seam, clean, deliberate, professionally fitted, running vertically from floor to ceiling, and a small recessed handle built flush into the drywall. Cody was looking at it with the expression of a man who has stumbled into someone else's story. "Did you know this was here?" he asked. I shook my head. My mouth had gone dry. He stepped back without being asked. I think he understood instinctively that whatever was behind that door belonged to me in a way that had nothing to do with real estate. I pulled the handle. The door swung inward on well-oiled hinges. Someone had maintained this, someone had used this, and revealed a space roughly the size of a coat closet, maybe 4 feet deep, 3 feet wide. The walls were bare drywall. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling on a pull string. On the floor sat a black leather briefcase, the expensive kind, with combination locks on both latches. And on top of the briefcase, held down by its own slight weight, was a photograph, color, recent, the kind of crisp digital clarity that smartphones produce. I picked it up with both hands, and that was when my hands began to shake. The man in the photograph was my husband, James Mitchell, who had been dead for 26 months. He was standing in what looked like a marina. Sunlight sailboat masts behind him, a wide blue sky. He was smiling. He was tan. He was wearing a linen shirt I had never seen before. He was alive. And beside him stood a dark-haired woman I did not recognize, and a little boy, perhaps 4 years old, who was holding James's hand. I stood in that closet for a very long time. Cody's voice, somewhere behind me, asking if I was all right, seemed to come from another world entirely. I sent Cody home. I made some excuse, a family emergency, a headache. It doesn't matter what I said. What mattered was that within 10 minutes, I was alone in the house, sitting on the bedroom floor with the photograph in my lap and the briefcase in front of me. My back was against the bed. I remember the carpet under my palms. I remember the light changing as afternoon moved toward evening. I remember not moving for a very long time. The combination locks. I tried James's birthday first. Old habit. Nothing. Our anniversary. Nothing. The year he claimed to have graduated from his MBA program, a detail I had memorized because he'd been so proud of it, nothing. Then, on a hunch that felt more like nausea than intuition, I tried the birth year of the little boy in the photograph. I didn't know it, of course. But I tried the year that would have made him 4 years old if James had conceived a child around the time our marriage was quietly dying. The latches clicked open. Inside, in banded stacks that were neat and uniform and absolutely real, was more money than I had ever seen in my life. I didn't count it that night. I would learn later, through a more careful inventory, that the total came to $2,040,000. But that evening, I simply looked at it, the way you look at something that your brain refuses to fully process, the way a crash survivor stares at the wreckage before the pain arrives. I closed the briefcase. I locked it. I put the photograph face down on the nightstand. Then I sat there and began the very deliberate, very methodical process of understanding what had happened to me. James had not died in a car accident. He had staged it. The closed casket, God, the closed casket, the body that had been too damaged for viewing, the insurance company that had paid out $750,000 in life insurance within 4 months of his death. Money I had accepted with shaking, grieving hands and put into a savings account because I couldn't bear to touch it. The trips he took every week, the clients he never introduced me to, the investment work I had never fully understood and never questioned because I was a trusting woman married to a man I believed loved me. He had built another life, somewhere, with another woman and what appeared to be their child. He had built it on money that was, I was increasingly certain, not legitimately earned. And he had hidden a portion of it, $2 million, are in a secret room in our shared home, which meant that at some point, James had planned to come back for it. That thought was what finally broke the paralysis. He was planning to come back. The fear hit me then, real, physical fear, the kind that lives in the chest and the stomach. I was alone in a house with $2 million in cash that belonged, in some legal or criminal sense I didn't yet understand, to a man who had faked his own death, committed insurance fraud, and for all I knew was capable of much worse. I thought about calling the police immediately. I thought about running. I thought about simply putting the briefcase back behind the door and pretending I'd never found it. I rejected all three options. Here is what I understood, sitting on that bedroom floor. If I called the police without preparation, I would lose all control of the narrative. The money would be seized, the investigation would move in directions I couldn't predict, and James, clever, careful James, might disappear again before anyone could touch him. If I ran, I would be leaving behind the only evidence and the only leverage I had. And if I did nothing, I was simply waiting for the predator to return on his own schedule. No. I had spent 2 years being passive in my grief. I was done being passive. The first thing I needed was information, not guesswork, not the frantic midnight theorizing of a woman alone with a photograph. Actual information. That meant a private investigator, someone discreet, someone who could find a living man who was supposed to be dead. The second thing I needed was legal protection. If $2 million in cash was sitting in my home, I needed an attorney before James or whoever else was connected to this money came looking for it. The third thing, and this was the coldest, most deliberate thought I had that evening, was documentation. Everything I had found needed to be photographed, recorded, cataloged. Not for the police, for me. Evidence I controlled. I went to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and sat at the table where I had graded 1,000 sets of papers. I opened my laptop and began to search for private investigators in the greater Chicago area. I was looking for someone with experience in fraud cases, someone with good reviews, someone I had never met and who had no connection to James or his world. I found a name, Raymond Kowalski, former Cook County detective, 21 years on the force, now private practice, specialization, financial fraud, missing persons, insurance investigations. I wrote his number on a piece of paper and folded it into my wallet. Then I photographed every single bill in that briefcase, fanned out in stacks on the bedroom floor. I photographed the briefcase itself, its make, its serial numbers, the combination locks. I photographed the hidden room from every angle. And I photographed the photograph of James and his other family 7 times, from different distances, until I was certain every detail was captured. I uploaded everything to a cloud account I created that night, under a name that wasn't mine. By the time I finished, it was past midnight. I made sure every door and window in the house was locked. I put the briefcase back in the hidden room and closed the door. And then I lay in bed with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling, thinking about a man who was supposed to be buried and wasn't. The swing I'd never put in the oak tree. All those years of waiting for a life that was already a lie. The anger was quieter than I expected. It was cold and clear and very, very focused. I called Raymond Kowalski at 8 o'clock the following morning from my car, parked 2 blocks from the house. I didn't explain everything, not yet. I told him I had reason to believe my deceased husband might be alive, that I had physical evidence supporting this, and that I needed to meet with him in person before taking any further steps. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that was neither surprised nor skeptical, but simply professional, "Can you come in today?" His office was on the 14th floor of a building in the Loop, the kind of modest, orderly space that inspires confidence precisely because it makes no effort to impress. Kowalski himself was in his early 50s, heavy-set, with the kind of face that has processed a great deal of human dishonesty without becoming cynical, only careful. I showed him the photographs on my phone. I told him about the insurance payout. I described the hidden room. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he looked at me for a moment and said, "Ms. Mitchell, if what you're describing is accurate, your husband committed insurance fraud, identity fraud, and depending on the source of the cash, potentially several federal financial crimes. Do you understand what that means for you legally?" I told him I understood that I needed an attorney before anything else moved forward. He nodded. He gave me a name, Thomas Bellamy, a former federal prosecutor who now handled complex financial cases in private practice. "Tell him I sent you," Kowalski said. "And Ms. Mitchell, don't touch that money again. Don't move it. Don't spend it. Don't tell anyone outside this room in Bellamy's office." I met Thomas Bellamy that same afternoon. He was a tall, lean man in his 60s with silver hair and the measured speech of someone who has learned that words, chosen carefully, are more powerful than raised voices. I laid out everything for him the way I had for Kowalski: the hidden room, the briefcase, the photograph, the insurance payment I had received. He listened, made notes in a yellow legal pad, and when I finished, he was quiet for several seconds. "You've done the right thing by coming here first," he said. "The cash is a complication, but not necessarily a problem for you. You found it on your property. You didn't know it was there. You reported it. Or rather, you are in the process of reporting it through proper legal channels, which is what we're doing right now. That sequence matters enormously." He advised me to formally notify the insurance company of the possibility that James was alive, a step that would be painful and complicated, as it would likely trigger a demand that I return the $750,000 payout. "But it also," he said, "puts you firmly in the position of the victim rather than the accomplice, and it puts pressure on James, wherever he is, in ways he cannot easily control." Meanwhile, Kowalski had begun working. He called me 3 days after our meeting, and even before he spoke, I could hear in the slight change of his breathing that he had found something. James Mitchell, using the name James Cartwright, was living in Sarasota, Florida. He had a rental house on a quiet canal street. A woman named Nina Vargas lived with him, and a 4-year-old boy named Marco. He had been living there, Kowalski told me, for almost 2.5 years. They had been building their life together for 6 months before James staged his death. I sat with that for a moment. I had been in that house on Callaway Drive grieving while James was in Florida, tan and smiling in his new linen shirt, watching his other son learn to walk. "Is there more?" I asked Kowalski. "Yes." A pause. "The source of the cash is fairly clear. James was running a parallel financial operation through his consultancy, diverting client investment funds into offshore accounts, small percentages at a time, accumulated over years. His business partner, a man named Derek Holt, appears to have been aware of it. The $2 million in your closet is likely Holt's cut, being held by James until the heat from the original disappearance died down." Derek Holt. I knew that name. I had met him at a Christmas party 3 years ago, a compact, well-dressed man with a very firm handshake and very careful eyes. James had spoken of him as a colleague, an associate, a friend. "So there are 2 of them," I said. "At minimum," said Kowalski. That evening, I received a phone call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer it. When I did, there was silence for 2, 3 seconds. And then the call disconnected. It was the kind of silence that feels intentional. I took a screenshot of the number and sent it to Kowalski. He called back within the hour. The number traced to a burner phone purchased in Sarasota, Florida. James knew I was moving. I called Thomas Bellamy and told him it was time to accelerate. The plan, as Bellamy and I had constructed it, had 3 components. First, a formal documented notification to the insurance company, Meridian Life, disclosing that I had evidence James Mitchell was alive and that the death benefits I had received may have been obtained through fraud. Bellamy filed this the following Monday morning. It was, as he had predicted, the opening of a door that could not be closed again. Second, Kowalski's file, photographs of James in Sarasota, financial records showing the fund diversions, documentation of the Derek Holt connection, was prepared in sealed form and held by Bellamy's office with a standing instruction that it be delivered to the FBI Financial Crimes Unit if anything happened to me. This was not paranoia. This was architecture. Third, I changed every lock in the house, installed a security camera system with cloud backup, and at Bellamy's suggestion, stayed with my friend Claire Sutton for the week while the legal machinery began to turn. Claire lived 20 minutes away in Evanston, in a second-floor apartment above a bookstore, and she was the only person outside my legal and investigative team who knew what was happening. I had told her everything the night before I moved in temporarily, over tea at her kitchen table, watching her expression move from disbelief to fury to something very calm and very protective. "Whatever you need," she said. "Whatever, for as long as you need it." That was Claire. I had known her since college. She was the kind of woman who doesn't offer help that she doesn't mean. On Wednesday of that week, 2 men appeared at the house on Callaway Drive. Cody, who had returned to continue the renovation work, and whom I had told nothing beyond the fact that the work would continue as planned, called me to say that 2 men were standing in the front yard. One was asking for me. He described them. One compact and well-dressed, one taller and quieter. Derek Holt, and someone I didn't yet know. I drove to the house. I parked across the street and watched them for a moment before getting out of the car. Derek Holt in the flesh was exactly as I remembered him from the Christmas party. Contained, polished, with the kind of smile that functions as a tool rather than an expression. He stepped forward when he saw me, and the smile engaged immediately. "Sarah, I'm so sorry to drop in unannounced. I've been meaning to reach out. I heard you were renovating the house, and I just wanted to see if there was anything I could do." The lie was so fluent, it was almost beautiful. I stood on the sidewalk, kept my voice level, and said, "Derek, this is a surprise. Why don't you tell me why you're really here?" The smile held for a second, then shifted into something else, something cooler, more direct. His companion, whom he did not introduce, moved slightly to his left, positioning himself between me and the street. "We know you found something in the house," Holt said quietly, "and we want you to understand clearly that it doesn't belong to you. We're asking you to cooperate, return what you found, say nothing to anyone, and move forward with your life. You've suffered enough, Sarah. This doesn't have to get any more complicated." "Are you threatening me?" I asked. I kept my voice flat. "I'm advising you," he said. "There's a difference." "My attorney would disagree," I said, "as would the insurance company, and the FBI office I've already been in contact with." The shift in Holt's face was subtle, but it was real. A flicker, a recalculation. "You should think carefully," he said. "I have," I told him, "very carefully, and I suggest you have your own attorney reach out to Thomas Bellamy. He's expecting to hear from you." I turned and walked back to my car without looking back. My hands were shaking so badly that I had difficulty getting the key into the ignition. I drove 3 blocks before I pulled over, gripped the steering wheel, and let myself breathe. But I had not backed down. I had not flinched. And I had named Bellamy, which meant they now knew there was a legal structure around me that they could not simply knock over with a phone call and a well-dressed associate. They retreated. I went back to Claire's apartment and I didn't leave for 3 days. She made soup. We watched old films. She didn't ask me to talk when I didn't want to talk, and she listened without interrupting when I did. On the second evening, sitting on her sofa, wrapped in a blanket she had pulled from her hall closet, I cried for the first time since finding the photograph. Not for James, not for what he had done, but for the 11 years I had given to a story that was never true. Claire sat beside me and didn't say a word, which was exactly what I needed. By the 3rd day, I was ready to continue. The offer arrived through an intermediary, a lawyer I had never met calling from a Chicago number who asked Bellamy if his client would be open to a private resolution. The terms, as relayed to me afterward, I would receive $300,000 in cash, deposited into an account of my choosing in exchange for returning the briefcase, destroying any copies of the documentation I had gathered, signing a non-disclosure agreement, and withdrawing my notification to Meridian Life Insurance. $300,000 for my silence, for erasing $2 million in hidden money and a faked death and 11 years of lies. I read Bellamy's summary of the offer twice, then set it down on the table in his office. "No," I said. Bellamy nodded, unsurprised. "I'll decline formally. They'll likely try again." Let them. What I felt in that moment was not the anger I might have expected, not the temptation of easy money after 2 years of financial worry. What I felt was something I can only describe as clarity, the particular calm that arrives when you realize you are, for the first time in a long time, operating entirely on your own terms. I understood what they were doing. James and Holt were frightened. The insurance company notification had triggered a formal investigation. Bellamy had confirmed this. Meridian Life had lawyers, and Meridian Life had the motivation to find a living man before paying another dollar. The $2 million sitting in a house that was now under legal scrutiny represented years of criminal accumulation, and without it, the architecture of James's new life, the Sarasota house, the boat I had seen in the background of the photograph, the comfortable anonymity of a dead man became considerably less stable. They needed me to go away, and I was not going away. During this period, I did something that Bellamy had gently suggested and that I had initially resisted. I began talking, within the boundaries of what was legally safe, to people who had been through similar experiences. There was a small community, connected through a victims support network Bellamy knew of people who had been defrauded by spouses or domestic partners, financial betrayal, identity theft, insurance fraud, people who had been erased from their own lives by someone they trusted completely. The first meeting was on a Thursday evening in the back room of a community center in Wicker Park. 8 people, folding chairs, bad coffee. A woman named Patricia, who had discovered her husband of 20 years, had a second family in Cincinnati. A man named Garrett, who had found out his wife had been systematically emptying his retirement accounts for a decade. Others with their own careful, quiet devastations. I did not tell my full story, but I listened to theirs, and something that had been very tight in my chest began, incrementally, to loosen. After the meeting, a woman named Diane, perhaps 60, with gray-streaked hair and an expression of hard-won peace, caught up with me near the door. "First time?" she asked. "Yes." It gets better, she said. Not easier, better. There's a difference. I thought about that on the drive home. There's a difference. It sounded like something Claire would say, or something I might write on a whiteboard for my 10th graders when they were wrestling with Gatsby's doomed romanticism, the gap between what we wish were true and what actually is. Kowalski called me that week with an update. There had been activity on James's financial accounts, small movements, the kind that suggest preparation. A man who was deciding whether to run again. If he runs, I asked, does that complicate things? It complicates things for him, Kowalski said. The moment he crosses a state line trying to evade a federal insurance fraud investigation, he adds to the charge sheet. But we should be prepared for it. What do we need to do? What you're already doing. Keep the legal process moving. Don't give them anything they can use, and don't be alone in that house. I wasn't. Claire had given me a key to her apartment. Bellamy's office checked in every 2 days, and the community of people in that back room in Wicker Park, strangers who understood, in the particular way that only those who have lived it can understand, were becoming, slowly, something that resembled a net beneath me. The antagonists watched and waited. I let them watch. James came to the house himself. I had not seen him in 2 years and 8 months. I had stood at what I believed was his grave and read a poem, Mary Oliver, When Death Comes, in front of his mother and 2 of his college friends and a handful of colleagues, including, I now understood, Derek Holt. He was standing on the front porch when I pulled into the driveway on a Tuesday evening in early June. I almost didn't recognize him at first. The Sarasota tan was deeper now, and he had grown a beard, and he was wearing sunglasses despite the fact that it was overcast, as if the disguise still mattered at this point. I sat in my car for a long moment. I checked the dash camera Kowalski had recommended I install 2 weeks prior. A small, discrete device aimed at the front of the house that recorded continuously to a cloud server. The red light was on. It was recording. I took one slow breath and got out of the car. Sarah. His voice was the same. That was the worst part somehow. The complete, ordinary familiarity of the voice of a man who had let me grieve him. The voice that had said good morning from the other side of a pillow for 11 years. The voice that had read aloud from the menu at our favorite restaurant in Wicker Park, the Italian place on the corner that we'd gone to every anniversary. That voice belonging now to a stranger. James, I said. He took off the sunglasses. His eyes, I had once thought they were the most honest thing about him, moved over my face with an expression I recognized from arguments we used to have, the calculated softness of a man preparing to be persuasive. He had used that expression when he'd forgotten birthdays, when he'd canceled trips at the last moment, when he'd arrived home late without explanation. I had always let it work on me before. Not today. "Can we talk?" he said. "Please, just talk. I owe you that much." We sat on the porch steps because I would not invite him inside, not into my home, not into the house where I had mourned him. He talked for a long time. I had prepared myself for this, but the actual texture of it was still difficult. The practiced regret, the carefully constructed narrative of a man who had felt trapped, who had been drowning in debt he hadn't known how to face, who had made a terrible decision in a moment of panic and then found himself unable to walk it back. He spoke about pressure, about Holt, about the investors, about the mounting liability that had felt like a wall closing around him. He made it sound almost reasonable, almost sympathetic. That was the most frightening part. Not that he was lying, but that some part of him had come to believe it. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said. I just want you to understand that this doesn't have to destroy everything. The money, it can be split. You keep half. You never have to see me again. You go on with your life. I go on with mine. Nobody has to get hurt." "Nobody has to get hurt," I repeated. "Sarah, you held a funeral for yourself," I said. "I stood at a grave and read a poem. Your mother cried James. She cried at your grave, and you were in Florida." Something moved across his face. Not remorse, I decided. Something more like irritation at being made to account for the inconvenient feelings of other people. The way certain men look when emotion is introduced into what they have decided should be a purely transactional conversation. "The money," he said again. $1 million, Sarah. Tax-free. You walk away from this clean. You don't have to deal with lawyers and federal investigations and all the rest of it. Think about what you could do. Travel. Move somewhere new. Start over properly. Isn't that what you want? Isn't that what Karen's been telling you to do for 2 years? The mention of Karen, my sister, a detail he could only have known by monitoring my calls or my email, sent a cold line of fear down my spine. He had been watching more closely than I realized, for longer. But the fear did not break me. It clarified me. "Stop." I said it quietly, but I said it the way I had learned in 20 years of teaching teenagers to mean it. The voice that stops a room. "Stop talking." He stopped. "You came here to buy my silence," I said. "The same way you sent Holt, the same way you sent the lawyer with the $300,000 offer. And the answer is the same as it's always been: no." His face changed. The performance of regret fell away, and what was underneath it was not grief or love or even the complicated tangle of guilt that I might have, in some small, naive way, hoped for. It was anger. Clean, entitled anger. The anger of a man who has decided that the world should arrange itself to his convenience and is genuinely baffled when it refuses. "You have no idea what you're starting," he said. "Holt has people, Sarah. Real people. The kind that don't care about your lawyer or your insurance company or any of the rest of it. You think this is just about money. There are people connected to this that you don't want to know about." It was the most honest thing he had said to me in perhaps our entire marriage. "Then I'll look forward to them explaining that to the FBI," I said. He stood up. For a moment, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Something like disbelief, or perhaps the belated recognition that he had fundamentally misunderstood who I was. Then he walked down the porch steps, did not look back once, and got into a black rental car parked at the curb and drove away without hurrying, which was somehow worse than if he had fled. I went inside. I locked the door. I stood in the hallway for a moment with my back against the wall, eyes closed, counting my breaths, the way Dr. Hernandez would later teach me to do. Then I called Bellamy and told him James had made contact, exactly as we had documented it was likely to happen, exactly as we needed it documented. He had admitted to knowing about the money, confirmed Holt's involvement, mentioned Karen by name in a way that suggested surveillance, and made what could reasonably be construed as a threat. I told him about the dash camera. He told me to send the footage to his secure server immediately. I sat at the kitchen table and I wrote down everything James had said, word for word while it was fresh, and emailed it to Bellamy within the hour as instructed. My hands were shaking. Not with fear, exactly, or not only with fear, with a particular combination of adrenaline and resolve that I was beginning to recognize as my new resting state. Every threat they made, I understood now, was also a mistake. Every time they came to me asking me to be quiet, they were confirming, in ways that would matter legally, that there was something to be quiet about. Let them come. Every visit was evidence. The federal hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in late September in a federal courthouse in downtown Chicago. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit had been active for 3 months by that point. Meridian Life Insurance had filed a civil suit for the recovery of the $750,000 in fraudulent death benefits. And the Cook County State's attorney had, on the basis of Kowalski's file and the additional evidence gathered through the federal investigation, issued arrest warrants for James Mitchell, legally still James Mitchell, whatever he called himself in Florida, and Derek Holt on charges including insurance fraud, wire fraud, investment fund misappropriation, and identity fraud. Holt had been arrested in Chicago 2 weeks prior in the parking garage of his River North office building. He had, I was told, said nothing. He had simply looked at the agents presenting the warrant with the expression of a man running through calculations, tallying damages, and finding the sum worse than he had anticipated. James had been arrested at the Sarasota rental house 3 days after Holt. There had been a brief period during which federal agents believed he might attempt to flee. Kowalski had been right about the financial activity, but the warrant had moved faster than James had. He was apprehended in the early morning before 7, while Marco was still asleep and Nina was in the kitchen making coffee. That detail, the particular ordinary domesticity of the moment, stayed with me longer than I expected it to. The hearing was a preliminary federal proceeding, not a trial, but it was the first time I would be in the same room as James, since he'd stood on my porch and threatened me with the names of people I didn't want to know about. I wore a charcoal suit I had bought specifically for the occasion. I had my hair done the night before, not out of vanity, but out of the deliberate, practical understanding that how a woman presents herself in a room full of men making judgments about her credibility is not a trivial matter. Bellamy had told me, without quite saying it, to look composed. I was composed. I had been working on it for months. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Bellamy to my left and Kowalski, present as a witness and investigator, 2 rows behind me. Claire was in the public gallery in the 3rd row, and when I turned before taking my seat, I could see her there, calm and steady, wearing the blue coat she'd had for years, her hands folded in her lap like someone who has settled in for as long as it takes. She caught my eye and gave the smallest possible nod. I turned back to face the front. James and Holt entered from a side door with their respective attorneys. James in a suit that was slightly too large, as if it had been acquired hastily, or as if the man wearing it had lost weight in the preceding months. He was no longer tan. The Florida ease was entirely gone. The linen shirts, the marina sunlight, the comfortable confidence of a man who believed he had successfully rewritten himself. He looked, I thought, like a man who had spent several weeks understanding, incrementally, the precise dimensions of his situation. He did not look at me when he entered. Then he did look at me, once, briefly, and looked away. I kept my face neutral. I had practiced that, too. Holt, by contrast, looked at no one. He sat down, opened a leather folder on the table before him, and studied its contents with the focused attention of a man who has decided to exist entirely within a very small perimeter. The proceeding lasted 4 hours. Bellamy presented with meticulous clarity the full sequence of documented evidence, the discovery of the hidden room, the insurance fraud notification, the subsequent federal investigation, Kowalski's surveillance report, the financial records, the offshore account trail, the phone records connecting James and Holt throughout the period of the supposed death. He presented it in chronological order, each document introduced calmly, each connection made explicit, each date and figure allowed to sit in the room and do its own quiet, devastating work. James's attorney attempted several times to introduce doubt. The money had been held for a client. The surveillance photos were circumstantial. The offshore accounts had legitimate explanations. Each attempt was met by Bellamy with a document, a date, a number, a record. The judge, a small, sharp-eyed woman named the Honorable Patricia Lowe, asked precise questions in a voice entirely devoid of theatrics. She was the kind of judge, I understood quickly, who is interested only in what can be demonstrated, and who has a very low tolerance for the kind of lawyerly fog that substitutes assertion for evidence. At one point, James's attorney suggested that my discovery of the briefcase had been orchestrated, that I had known about the hidden room before the renovation began, that the renovation itself had been undertaken with the purpose of establishing a false narrative of discovery. It was the most audacious argument of the day, and it landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples of tension outward. Bellamy was on his feet before the ripples settled. He introduced, in sequence, the original renovation contract dated 4 months prior, Pete Garvey's deposition confirming that the removal of the shelving unit had been Cody's suggestion and not mine, Cody's own signed statement, and the timestamp on my cloud upload of the photographs, made within hours of the discovery, before I had spoken to any attorney or investigator, before I had any reason to fabricate a timeline. The judge's expression did not change, but the attorney sat down. The breaking point came when the prosecutor introduced the phone records from the burner phone in Sarasota, the one that had called me in the silent hours, the night after I met with Kowalski and Bellamy. The records placed that call at a specific time, connected to a specific cell tower, in a specific location consistent with James's Sarasota address. His attorney said the connection was unprovable, circumstantial, a coincidence of geography. James said, "That's enough." His attorney turned to him sharply, hand half raised in the instinctive gesture of a lawyer trying to silence a client in real time. "James, I said that's enough." His voice was not loud, but it was frayed in a way that I could hear from across the room. The voice of a man whose internal structure has given way, the way a load-bearing beam sounds before it fails. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands, the same hands I had held at an altar, the same hands that had signed our joint tax returns for 11 years. Then he looked at me, for the second time, and longer this time, a full 3 or 4 seconds, and I held his gaze without expression, without anger, without satisfaction, without any of the things I might have expected to feel. I simply looked at him, steadily, the way you look at something you have finally, after a very long time, seen clearly. He looked away first. Holt, from the adjacent table, leaned close to his attorney and said something very quietly. The attorney's posture changed, a slight forward shift, a recalibration, the body language of someone who has just received information that changes the available options. Judge Lowe called a 15-minute recess. During that recess, word reached Bellamy that Holt's attorney wished to discuss the possibility of a cooperation agreement with the prosecution. Bellamy came back to our table and set his pen down with a very slight smile, the restrained expression of a man who knew 3 months ago that this moment was coming and has been waiting for it with the patience of someone who works in facts. "That's it," he said quietly. "That's the moment." And it was. I had read enough legal thrillers to understand intellectually what a cooperation agreement meant. One defendant offering testimony against another in exchange for reduced charges. But I hadn't understood until that moment what it looks like from the other side of the table. 2 men who had carefully constructed a mutual story, a story they had agreed on and committed to and built a shared future upon, each watching the other decide whether the story was still worth protecting. It wasn't. The edifice they had built, over years, with extraordinary patience and not inconsiderable intelligence, came apart in a federal courthouse on a Thursday afternoon in September, before a judge who asked precise questions, and across the room from a woman in a charcoal suit who had decided 6 months earlier in a bedroom closet not to be quiet. Holt cooperated fully. Over the following 6 weeks, he provided federal prosecutors with a comprehensive account of the scheme. The client fund diversions that had begun 7 years before James's staged death, the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and in a bank in Montenegro, the deliberate construction of the accident, the falsified documentation, the corruption of a county medical examiner who had, for $30,000, certified a body as James Mitchell without adequate verification. There was a body, a transient who had died of an overdose, whose records had been manipulated. That element, when it was made public, became a separate criminal matter of its own. Derek Holt was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. His cooperation secured him a reduction from what would otherwise have been, his attorney acknowledged, closer to 20. He lost his consulting practice, his professional licenses, his home in River North. His wife filed for divorce before the sentencing was complete. James pleaded guilty to insurance fraud, wire fraud, investment fraud, and 4 additional counts connected to the falsified death documentation. He was sentenced to 14 years in a federal correctional facility. The Sarasota house was seized as a criminal asset. The offshore accounts, not all of the money had been spent, were subject to federal forfeiture proceedings and civil claims from the defrauded investors. Nina Vargas, the woman in the photograph, was found to have been largely uninformed of the criminal origins of James's money. She was not charged with any crime. She moved, I heard later, back to her family in California with her son Marco. I felt something complicated about her. Not quite sympathy, not quite anger, but the particular sorrow you feel for someone whose life was built on the same lies yours was, who is not the villain, but is also not exactly innocent of willful ignorance. The $750,000 I had received from Meridian Life was a more complex matter. Bellamy negotiated, and this was the piece of legal architecture I was most grateful for. A resolution in which I returned the full amount was formally cleared of any complicity in the fraud and was additionally recognized as the primary victim in the civil complaint. This meant that when the civil recovery proceedings began, clawing back what the defrauded investors and the insurance company could recover from the seized assets, I was positioned as a creditor. I recovered, over the following 18 months of civil litigation, just over $400,000. It was not what the $2 million in the briefcase might have represented if I had taken the easy path, but it was real, it was clean, and it was mine in a way that no amount of purchase silence could ever have been. The money from the briefcase was formally seized by federal authorities. I handed it over, in the presence of Bellamy and 2 federal agents, on a Thursday morning in October. I had not touched a dollar of it. On the afternoon of the day the sentencing was handed down, I drove to the house on Callaway Drive. The renovation had been completed in my absence. Pete Garvey had done excellent work as promised, and the house was empty and clean and smelled of fresh paint and new wood floors. I walked through every room, the bedroom where the closet had been opened, the kitchen where I had graded papers at midnight, the backyard with the old oak tree. I stood under the oak for a while. The light was good. Late October, the leaves nearly gone, the kind of clear, cold afternoon that feels like a fresh start if you choose to read it that way. Then I called a real estate agent and told her the house was ready to list. The house sold in 11 days for significantly more than the appraised value. I used a portion of the proceeds as a down payment on a smaller house in Evanston, 6 blocks from Claire's apartment, on a tree-lined street where the neighbors left Christmas cards in each other's mailboxes. It had a garden, a small walled garden in the back, overgrown and slightly neglected, with the structure of something that had once been loved and could be loved again. I didn't know anything about gardening. I learned. I returned to teaching in the fall. We read The Awakening, and I taught the passage where Edna walks into the sea, not as a defeat, but as an act of will, the refusal to live a life that does not belong to you. My students argued about it for 3 days. It was the best class I taught in 20 years. I began seeing a therapist named Dr. Hernandez. We talked about James, about grief and anger, about what I wanted the rest of my life to look like. Slowly, those conversations began to feel less like excavation and more like architecture. Claire came to dinner once a week. We sat in the garden when the evenings were warm enough. By the second year, I had dinner with a man named Paul, a landscape architect, quiet and genuinely kind. We took things slowly. He said he had never met anyone who paid such careful attention to the world around her. I told him that was a recent development. He laughed. I liked his laugh. James served his sentence in Indiana. His mother never spoke to him again. She sent me a card once. "I'm sorry, Sarah, for all of it." I kept it in a drawer. Holt emerged from prison to a life that was, by any measure, smaller and harder and lonelier than the one he had built. His wife had left. His children did not attend his release. His practice was gone. Nina Vargas moved back to California with Marco. I hoped for the boy. I had no reason not to. The hidden door had been filled in during the renovation. A smooth wall now with a mirror on it. A house forgets its own history and becomes, to a new family, simply a home. I was happy. Quietly, durably, honestly happy. The kind that knows what it has survived. In the garden the second summer, the climbing rose came in. It was worth the wait. What did I learn? This. The truth does not require your permission to exist. It simply waits. Behind closed doors, in combination locked cases, in the quiet spaces behind the things we have been afraid to move. I learned that the instinct to protect yourself is not selfishness. It is survival. I learned that asking for help is not weakness. It is the very structure of how human beings endure. And I learned that the most dangerous thing you can do to someone who has underestimated you is to simply refuse to be what they imagined.